Let's start this by understanding what asynchronous JavaScript actually is, and also learn about the most popular use cases of asynchronous JavaScript, which is basically to make so-called AJAX calls to APIs. Now, to understand what asynchronous JavaScript code actually is, we first need to understand what synchronous code is. So basically the opposite of asynchronous. So most of the code we have been writing so far in the course has been synchronous code. And synchronous simply means that the code is executed line by line in the exact order of execution that we defined in our code. Just like in this small example, so as the first line of the code to reach the execution, it is simply executed in the execution of threads. Now don't worry about the execution of thread. It's not important here. It's just to make a pointer of a synchronous versus asynchronous code, as you will see in the next slide. All we need to know is that execution of the thread is part of the execution context, which does actually execute the code and the computer's processor. But anyway, then the next line of code is executed and the next one all in sequence. So each line of the code waits for the previous line to finish execution. Now this can create problems so when one line of the code takes a long time to run. For example, this current line of code, we have an allow statement which creates this allow window. Now as we have experienced in the past, this allow window will block the code execution, so nothing will happen on the page until we click that OK button, and only then the code can continue executing. And so the allow statement is a perfect example of a long-running operation which blocks the execution of the code. So again, only after we click the OK button, the window disappears and the next line can run. So this is hopefully a nice illustration of the problem with the synchronous code. Now most of the time synchronous code is fine and makes perfect sense, but imagine that execution will have to wait for example for a 5-second timer to finish. That would just be terrible, because meanwhile nothing on the page will work during these 5 seconds, and so that's where the asynchronous code comes into play. So this example contains the 5-second timer that I just mentioned. The first line of code is still synchronized here. We also move to a second line in a synchronized way, but here we encounter the set timer function, which will basically start a timer in an asynchronous way. So this means that the timer will essentially run in the background without preventing the main code from executing. We also register a cover function which will not be executed now, but only after the timer has finished running, and we have actually already done this many times before in the practice. Now this cover function that I just mentioned is asynchronous JavaScript, and it is asynchronous because it's only going to be executed after a task that is running in the background finish execution. In this case, that is the timer. So this cover function that I just talked about is a register. We immediately move on to the next line. So the main code is not being blocked, and execution does not wait for asynchronous timers to finish its work, and that's the big difference between synchronized and asynchronous code. So previously we have to wait for the user to click on the allow window to continue execution, and again that's because the allow is blocking synchronized code. But now with this timer, the cover is actually asynchronized, and so it's only going to be executed after the timer has finished, and so therefore we say that is not blocking, because in the meantime the rest of code is keep running normally. Now when the timer finally finishes after 5 seconds, the callback function finally will be executed as well. So you will see that this callback runs after all the other code, even though in the code it does not appear at the end. So basically an action was deferred into the future here in order to make the code not blocky. And actually we already saw this behavior happening before when we first learned about the timers. We just didn't know that this is called asynchronous and not blocking code. So in summary, asynchronous programming is all about coordinating the behavior of our program over a certain period of time, and this is essential to understand. So asynchronous literally means not occurring at the same time, and so that's what asynchronous programming is all about. Now as we saw in this example, we need callback functions to implement this asynchronous behavior. However, that does not mean that callback functions automatically make it asynchronous. This is just not the case. For example, a remember method accepts a callback function as well, but that does not make the code asynchronous. Only certain functions such as timeout work in an asynchronous way. We just have to know which ones do, which ones don't. But please understand this very important fact that callback functions alone do not make code asynchronous. That's essential to keep in mind. But anyway, in order to really understand this, let's see another example. So this example is about loading an image. So the first two lines run in a synchronized way, one after the other. Now in the second line, we set the sole attribute of the image that we selected in the first line. And this operation is actually asynchronous. So setting the sole attribute of any image is essentially loading an image in the background while the rest of the code can keep running. Imagine that it's a huge image. We wouldn't want our entire code to wait for the image to load. That's why setting the source attribute was implemented in JavaScript in an asynchronous way. Now once the image has finished loading, a load event will automatically be emitted by JavaScript. And so we can then listen for that event in order to add on it. Listening for the load event is exactly what we do here in the next line as well. So here we use add event listener and to register a callback function for the load event. So just like in previous example, we provide a callback function that will be executed once the image has been loaded and not right away, because again all this code is non-blocky. So instead of blocking, execution moves on right to the next line immediately. Then once the image is completely loaded, it's displayed on the web page and the load event is emitted. And since we are listening for that event, our callback function is finally executed. So once more, we deferred an actions to the future, making the code asynchronous and non-blocking. And so now at this point, I believe that you have a pretty good understanding of asynchronous code. There is just one more important thing that I need to mention, which is the fact that event listener alone do not make code asynchronous. Just like a callback functions alone do also not make code asynchronous. For example, an event listener listening for a click on a button is not doing any work in the background. It's simply waiting for a click to happen, but it's not doing anything. And so there is no asynchronous behavior involved at all. So now what makes this code example asynchronous is simply the fact that the image is loading asynchronously in the background, but not the fact that we are listening for the load events to happen. We are listening for the load events to happen. So one method is the asynchronous behavior of a task, like running a timer or loading an image. And there are more examples of asynchronous behavior in JavaScript, like the geolocation API or AJAX calls. And AJAX calls are probably the most important use case of asynchronous JavaScript. And so let's see what AJAX call is all about. So it just stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and basically it allows us to communicate with remote servers in a synchronous way. Now in practice, we make a just call in our code in order to request some data from a web server dynamically. So without reloading the page, so that we can use that data in our application dynamically. For example, right in the next video, we are going to make a just call to request data about countries. And we can then use that data about the countries to build a small application that allow us information about the country that we are currently in, and the possibilities and use cases are endless. But more about that in the next slide. For now, let's quickly understand how it just works. So let's say that we have our JavaScript application running in the browser, which is also called the client. And we want the application to get some data from the web browser. And let's say the data about the countries that I'm talking about earlier. So with the AJAX, we can do an HTTP request to the server, which has this data. And the server will then send back a response containing that data that we requested. And this back and forth between client and server all happens asynchronously in the background, just the way we learned before. And there can even be different types of requests, like a get a request to receive data or post a request to send the data to a server. Now when we are asking a server to send up some data, this server usually contains a web API, and this API is the one that has the data that we are asking for. So an API is something pretty important. And so let's now see what an API and a web APIs actually are. So first of all, API stands for Application Programming Interface. Now in general terms, and on very high level of abstraction, an API is basically a piece of software that can be used by another piece of software in order to basically allow applications to talk to each other and exchange information. And that's true not only for web development and JavaScript, but for the programming in general. Now in JavaScript and web development, there are countless types of API, like the DOM API or the geolocation API that we have been using. So these are called API because they are a self-contained piece of software that allow other pieces of software to interact with them. For example, our mapping application. Also, we can always implement a small and simple API in a class where we make some methods available as a public interface. So again, objects made from a class can be seen as a self-contained encapsulated pieces of software that other pieces of software software can interact with. And so that fits the definition of API. But now let's talk about the important type of API that we are actually interested in when we use AJAX, and that are APIs that I like to call online API. So an online API is essentially an application running on a web server which receives requests for data, then retrieves this data from some database, and then sends this back to the client. So just as we saw in the last slide, now when building application in practice, we simply call these online APIs API. Many people will also call these APIs web APIs, or again just simply API. So the term online API is actually a term that I came up with myself, because the term web API is actually also used for the other things. Now of course we can build our own online APIs, but that requires backend development. So development with the servers and database and all that, and this is something really interesting. But anyway, for now we are interested in using third-party APIs, so APIs that other developers make available for us, most of the times for free. So let's now imagine that you are building a traveling application and you have a database with the different destinations and tools that you are offering. So on your own server, you could build your own API that can receive requests from your front-end application and JavaScript and send back the results. So that will be your own API hosted on your own server. So that load will probably not be enough to build a complete application. And so you could also use some third-party APIs, and there are really APIs for everything. So in our example, travel application, you could use an API to get the weather data and your destinations, data about the destination countries themselves, data about flights, about currency conversion, and you could even use APIs to send emails or text messages, or embed a Google Maps into your applications. So as you see, the possibilities are really endless with the APIs, and we can even say that API is what made the modern web as you know it possible in the first place. So using APIs and JavaScript is super popular, and everyone does it all the time. But now to finish, let's quickly talk about the API data formats. So AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So the X there stands for XML. XML is a data format which used to be widely used to transmit data on the web. However, these days, basically no API use XML data anymore. The term AJAX is just an old name that got very popular back in the day, and so it's still used today even though we don't use the XML anymore. So instead, most APIs these days use the JSON data format. So JSON is the most popular data format today because it's basically just a JavaScript object but converted to a string, and so therefore it's very easy to send across the web and also to use in the JavaScript once the data arrives. So now that we know what the asynchronous JavaScript is and also what the AJAX and the APIs are, so let's finally use all this in practice and make our very first AJAX call in the next video.